Billionaire Lilia Hart had everything a media empire worth. Billions, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and access to the best specialists money could buy. But none of it could help her reach her own daughter. For years, 7-year-old Sophie lived behind a wall no one could break through, until a black single father working as a caterer did something no expert had ever tried. That morning, Stephen Randy woke before his alarm. The radiator in his Brooklyn apartment clanked against the winter cold, and somewhere outside a car horn blared. He lay still, counting the cracks in the ceiling the way he did every morning since Angela died 3 years ago. A soft thud came from the next room. Jaden was awake. Stephen found his son sitting on the edge of the bed, hands clamped over his ears, body rocking in a tight rhythm. The garbage truck outside was grinding through its morning route. To Jaden, those sounds hit like physical blows. Stephen knelt in front of him and held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. When he reached 0, he pressed his palm gently against Jaden's chest. Steady pressure. No words. This was how they spoke to each other when the world became too loud. 12 minutes later, Jaden lowered his hands. His brown eyes found his father's face, and something close to a smile crossed his lips. Getting dressed was a careful ritual. Stephen chose shirts without tags, socks without seams, pants with soft elastic waistbands. Breakfast was plain oatmeal at room temperature served in the blue bowl because the red one made Jaden cry for reasons neither of them could explain. These details weren't preferences. They were survival. Stephen was washing the dishes when his phone buzzed. A text from his lawyer, Dorothy, filed. Court date in 3 weeks. Call me. His hands went still in the soapy water. Dorothy was Angela's mother. 6 months ago, she had looked Stephen in the eye and told him she was suing for custody of Jaden. She believed he couldn't provide what her grandson needed. Not enough money. Not enough time. Not enough of whatever it was she thought a child like Jaden required. Stephen looked at his son, who was arranging his oatmeal into a perfect spiral before taking the first bite. Everything Stephen did now would be examined, questioned, used against him in a courtroom. Every choice he made for Jaden could be twisted into evidence of his failure. He couldn't think about that now. He had a shift to work, and the catering company didn't care about custody battles. He dropped Jaden at his specialized school, kissed the top of his head, and took the train into Manhattan. Lilia Hart stood in the windows of her penthouse office, watching the city wake up 47 floors below. Her reflection stared back at her tailored suit, perfect posture, the face that Fortune magazine had called unreadable. She had built Hart Media from a single local news station into a $4.7 billion empire. She had survived a divorce, a hostile takeover attempt, and a board that questioned every decision she made. None of it had prepared her for this morning. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Ms. Hart, Dr. Patterson is asking if you can join Sophie's session." Lilia checked her schedule. She had 10 minutes before her next call. "I'm coming." The sensory room had cost $200,000 to design. Padded walls, adjustable lighting, specialized equipment that was supposed to help Sophie process the world without falling apart. Lilia watched through the observation window as her daughter sat in the corner, tracing the same pattern on the floor over and over while the therapist spoke in a carefully modulated voice. Sophie didn't look up. She never looked up anymore. Lilia entered the room and knelt at the prescribed distance. The rules said she couldn't touch Sophie unless Sophie initiated contact. The rules said she had to wait to be patient to let her daughter come to her. Lilia had never been good at waiting. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said softly. Sophie's fingers kept moving. Trace, trace, trace. The same pattern, the same silence. Lilia's phone buzzed in her pocket. The conference call was starting. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and walked toward the door. She was almost through it when her brother appeared. Richard was 2 years younger and had spent his entire career in her shadow. As vice president of Hart Media, he handled the details she didn't have time for. He was good at details, sometimes too good. "The gala tonight," he said, matching her stride as she walked toward her office. We need Sophie there. No. The board is asking questions, Lelia. The canceled appearances, the rumors about Sophie's condition. They're wondering if you can manage your own family. Lelia stopped walking. She turned to face him, her expression flat. Are they wondering? Or are you helping them wonder? Richard's smile didn't waver. I'm trying to protect you. One appearance. One photo of you and Sophie looking happy together. That's all it takes to make this go away. She studied him for a long moment. Richard had always wanted her position. He'd been patient about it, building alliances, waiting for her to stumble. She had always known this. She just hadn't expected him to use her daughter as leverage. But she was tired. Tired of fighting the board, the press, the endless specialists who couldn't tell her why her daughter was slipping further away every day. Fine, she said. But I control the environment. Limited press, soft lighting, 20 minutes maximum. Richard was already typing on his tablet. I'll handle everything. The Heart Foundation Gala was the kind of event Stephen only saw in photographs. Crystal chandeliers, ice sculptures, women wearing jewelry that cost more than his apartment building. His job was to set up service stations, stay out of sight, and avoid making eye contact with anyone important. The catering company had been very clear about that last rule. He was arranging champagne glasses in a service corridor when the screaming started. At first he thought someone was hurt, an accident maybe, or a medical emergency. But as the sound continued rising and falling in jagged waves, something in his chest tightened with recognition. He knew that frequency of distress. He had heard it from Jaden 100 times. He pushed through the service door into the ballroom. A small girl in a white dress was on the floor near the stage, thrashing against the marble. A woman in medical scrubs tried to hold her arms down. Security guards shouted at the crowd to step back. And in the center of it all, frozen under the blazing lights, stood Lelia Hart. Stephen watched as another specialist approached, speaking loudly and firmly, trying to cut through the girl's panic. But every word, every touch, every flashing camera was making it worse. The girl's nervous system was drowning in input, and everyone who tried to help was pushing her deeper under. Security was moving through the crowd now, clearing a perimeter. One of them spotted Stephen in his catering uniform and started toward him. Stephen was already walking. He didn't run. Running would add to the chaos. He moved steadily toward the girl, ignoring the guard's commands, ignoring the gasps from the crowd, ignoring everything except the small figure on the cold marble floor. 10 feet away, he sat down. Cross-legged back slightly turned, making himself small and unthreatening. Just a presence at the edge of her storm. He began to count. Low and steady, the same tone he used with Jaden. 10, 9, 8, 7. The screaming continued, but something shifted. A hesitation between one shriek and the next. 6, 5, 4. No urgency in his voice, no fear, just numbers falling like rain. 3, 2, 1. Silence. Stephen extended his hand palm up and waited. He didn't look at the girl. He didn't move. He just breathed and let the quiet settle around them. 10 seconds passed. 20. The ballroom held its breath. Then small fingers closed around his. Stephen turned slowly. The girl was staring at him with red-rimmed eyes, her chest still heaving, but the panic had drained from her face. In its place was something that looked almost like wonder, like she had finally found someone who spoke her language. Footsteps approached behind him, security guards ready to drag him away from the billionaire's daughter. Stop! The voice was cold and commanding. Lelia Hart walked forward, her heels clicking against the marble. She looked at Stephen, then at her daughter's hand wrapped around his, then at the calm that had settled over Sophie's face for the first time in months. What's your name? Stephen Randy, ma'am. Lelia's gaze moved to her brother, who was watching from the edge of the crowd with an expression Stephen couldn't read. Then back to Stephen. My office. Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. She turned to Richard. Clear the room. The gala is over. Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded and began directing security. As the crowd dispersed, Stephen stayed where he was, Sophie's small hand still gripping his. For the first time that night, the girl smiled. Stephen arrived at Heart Media headquarters at 8:45 the next morning. The building rose 60 stories into the Manhattan sky, all glass and steel, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from owning half the city's media landscape. He had put on his only suit, the one he'd worn to Angela's funeral, and stood in the lobby feeling like a trespasser. The receptionist looked at him the way people always looked at him in places like this. Polite suspicion. Professional distance. She made a phone call, checked his name twice, and finally handed him a visitor badge. 47th floor. Ms. Hart's assistant will meet you. The elevator was mirrored on all sides. Stephen watched his reflection multiply into infinity and tried not to think about how out of place he looked. Lilia's assistant led him through a maze of glass-walled offices where people in expensive clothes pretended not to stare. At the end of the hallway, a set of double doors opened into an office the size of his entire apartment. Lilia Hart stood by the windows, silhouetted against the morning sun. She didn't turn around when he entered. "Close the door." Stephen did. He waited. "I had my team research you last night," Lilia said, still facing the windows. "Stephen Randy, 38 years old, widowed 3 years ago. One son, age 6, enrolled in a specialized program for children with sensory processing disorders. Currently employed by Elite Catering Services at $14.50 an hour." She turned to face him. "You're also being sued for custody by your mother-in-law. Court date in 3 weeks." Stephen felt his jaw tighten. "You've been thorough." "I'm always thorough." Lilia walked to her desk and sat down. "What you did last night with my daughter? Where did you learn that?" "I didn't learn it anywhere. I just know what it's like to have a kid who feels too much. The specialists I've hired have degrees from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford. They've published papers. They've won awards." Lilia's voice was flat controlled. "None of them have ever been able to do what you did in 30 seconds. Stephen didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Lilia studied him for a long moment. Then she opened a folder on her desk. "I'm prepared to offer you a position as Sophie's personal care assistant. The salary would be 10 times what you're currently making. Full benefits, flexible hours. You would have access to resources most people can't imagine." Stephen thought about his empty bank account. He thought about the lawyer's fees piling up the court date looming Dorothy's accusations that he couldn't provide for Jaden. This offer could solve everything. "No," he said. Lilia's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "No, I can't take care of your daughter and mine at the same time. And if I spend all my time here, that's exactly what Dorothy will use against me in court." Stephen shook his head. "I'm sorry. I can't." For the first time since he'd entered the room, something shifted in Lilia's expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition, like she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "What if you didn't have to choose?" she said. "What if you brought your son here?" Stephen frowned. "What do you mean?" "Sophie has never connected with anyone the way she connected with you last night. I don't know why, and frankly, I don't care why. I just know that I need whatever it is you have." Lilia leaned forward. "Bring Jaden with you. Let him spend time with Sophie. I'll provide tutors, therapists, whatever he needs, and I'll give you access to my legal team for your custody case." It was more than generous. It was almost suspicious. Stephen had learned a long time ago that people like Lilia Hart didn't give anything away for free. "Why would you do that?" he asked. Lilia's mask slipped just for a second. Underneath it, Stephen saw something that looked like exhaustion, like desperation. "Because I've tried everything else," she said quietly, "and nothing has worked." The first week was strange for everyone. Stephen brought Jaden to the Hart penthouse every morning, navigating a world of marble floors and priceless artwork that made both of them nervous. Sophie's team of specialists watched him with barely concealed skepticism. The nannies whispered to each other when they thought he couldn't hear. Richard Hart stopped by twice, asking pointed questions about Stephen's qualifications and methodology that felt more like interrogations than conversations. But none of that mattered when Stephen watched Jaden and Sophie together. The two children didn't interact at first. They existed in parallel, occupying the same space without acknowledging each other. Jaden sat in one corner of the sensory room, arranging blocks in precise patterns. Sophie sat in another corner, tracing her endless shapes on the floor. They didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. And yet something was happening between them. Stephen could feel it, could feel a kind of silent communication that didn't require words. On the fourth day, Sophie stood up and walked across the room. She stopped in front of Jaden and held out her hand. In her palm was a small gray stone, smooth and round, the kind you might find at the bottom of a riverbed. Jaden looked at the stone. He looked at Sophie. Then very slowly he reached out and took it. It was the first time Sophie had voluntarily given anything to anyone in over a year. Sit. Lelia watched through the observation window, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. Stephen stood beside her, saying nothing. "She's never done that before," Lelia said finally. "Not with the therapists, not with the nannies, not with me." Stephen understood what she wasn't saying. The rejection, the years of trying to reach a daughter who seemed to exist behind glass, visible but untouchable. "It's not about you," he said. "Jaden gets it because he feels the same things she feels. The world is too loud for both of them, too bright, too much." He watched the two children sitting together in comfortable silence. They don't have to explain themselves to each other. That's rare. Lilia was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its sharpness. "How did you learn to help your son? Trial and error, lots of error." Stephen remembered those first months after Angela died, when Jaden's meltdowns had been constant, and he had felt like he was drowning. "I read books, watched videos, talked to other parents, but mostly I just paid attention. Jaden couldn't tell me what he needed, so I had to figure it out from watching him. I've hired people to watch Sophie, dozens of them. Watching isn't the same as seeing." Stephen turned to face her. "Your specialists are looking for symptoms to diagnose and behaviors to correct. I'm looking for a person who's trying to tell me something." Lilia's jaw tightened. For a moment, Stephen expected her to argue. Instead, she asked, "What is Sophie trying to tell me?" "I don't know yet, but I think if you stopped trying to fix her and started trying to understand her, you might find out." The changes came slowly at first. Stephen convinced Lelia to reduce Sophie's therapy sessions from 6 hours a day to 3. He suggested removing half the equipment from the sensory room, creating more open space. He asked the staff to speak more quietly, move more slowly, dim the lights throughout the penthouse. Lelia resisted every change. She had spreadsheets and studies and expert opinions that contradicted everything Stephen suggested. But she also had a daughter who was starting to make eye contact again, who was sleeping through the night for the first time in months, who had begun to hum softly to herself while she played. 2 weeks into the arrangement, Sophie spoke her first word in almost a year. Stephen was sitting with both children in the sensory room, building a tower of blocks that Jaden kept redesigning according to some internal blueprint only he understood. Sophie was watching them closer than usual, her body angled toward Jaden in a way that suggested interest rather than avoidance. Jaden placed a blue block on top of the tower. The structure wobbled. Sophie reached out and steadied it with one finger. "Jaden," she said. The word was soft, almost a whisper, but Stephen heard it, and when he looked up, Sophie was smiling. He found Lelia in her home office, staring at quarterly reports she wasn't actually reading. "Sophie said a word." Lilia's head snapped up. "What?" "Jaden. She said his name." For a moment, Lilia's carefully constructed mask crumbled completely. Her eyes filled with tears, she blinked away before they could fall. She stood up so quickly her chair rolled back and hit the wall. "I want to see her." They walked to the sensory room together. Through the observation window, they could see Sophie and Jaden still building their tower, still existing in that shared space where neither of them had to be anything other than exactly who they were. "She's in there," Stephen said quietly. "She always has been. She just needed someone to wait for her." Lilia pressed her palm against the glass. "I don't know how to wait," she admitted. "I've spent my whole life making things happen, forcing outcomes, controlling variables." She shook her head. "I don't know how to be the kind of mother she needs. So, learn." Stephen watched her carefully. "You taught yourself to run a company worth billions of dollars. You can teach yourself this." Lilia turned to look at him. "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple. It's just necessary." That evening, Lilia called Stephen into her office. Her laptop was open, displaying what looked like legal documents. "I spoke to my attorney about your custody case," she said. "He reviewed the filing. Dorothy's argument is that you lack the financial resources and time to properly care for Jaden." Lilia closed the laptop. "With your permission, I'd like to provide you with legal representation, the best in the city." Stephen felt the familiar resistance rise in his chest. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity. It's compensation." Lilia met his gaze directly. "You're doing something for my daughter that no amount of money could buy. The least I can do is make sure your son stays where he belongs." Stephen wanted to say no. He had been saying no to help for 3 years, convinced that accepting it meant admitting he couldn't do this alone. But Lilia's words from earlier echoed in his head. She had spent her whole life controlling outcomes. Maybe he had spent his whole life refusing to let anyone in. "You teach me to see Sophie," Lilia said quietly. "Let me help you keep Jaden." Stephen nodded slowly. "Okay, Che." Richard Hart watched his sister's transformation with growing alarm. For years, he had positioned himself as the steady hand behind Lilia's empire, the one who handled the details while she chased headlines. He had cultivated relationships with board members, planted seeds of doubt about her leadership, waited for the moment when her carefully constructed image would crack. Sophie had been the key. A daughter Lilia couldn't control, couldn't fix, couldn't hide from the public eye. Every failed therapy, every canceled appearance, every whispered rumor about the Hart heir's condition had weakened Lilia's position. Richard had even helped things along quietly, replacing competent specialists with ones he knew would fail, ensuring that Sophie's struggles remained visible and constant. Now somehow a catering worker from Brooklyn was undoing all of it. Richard made some phone calls. He learned about Stephen's custody battle. He obtained Dorothy's contact information. And one afternoon, while Lilia was in meetings and Stephen was with the children, he picked up the phone. "Mrs. Randy, this is Richard Hart. I believe we have some mutual interests to discuss." 3 weeks after Stephen began working with Sophie, Richard announced that Hart Media would be hosting a special segment on childhood developmental disorders. The foundation would highlight its charitable work. Sophie would make a brief appearance to demonstrate the company's commitment to families facing similar challenges. Lilia refused immediately. "Absolutely not. She's not ready." "The board is expecting this," Richard said smoothly. "We've already announced it to the press. Canceling now would raise exactly the kind of questions we've been trying to avoid." Stephen watched the exchange from across the room. Something about Richard's insistence felt wrong, calculated in a way he couldn't quite identify. "I don't like this," he said quietly to Lilia after Richard left. "Neither do I. But he's right about the board." Lilia rubbed her temples. "If I back out now, they'll use it as evidence that I can't handle the pressure. Richard's been building that narrative for months. Then let me be there. Let me stay close to Sophie during the segment." Lilia nodded slowly. "I'll make sure you have access." The day of the broadcast, everything felt wrong. The segment was supposed to be filmed in Heart Media's main studio, a controlled environment with soft lighting and limited personnel. But when Stephen arrived with Sophie that morning, he found the location had been changed. They were now filming in a smaller studio on a different floor, one with harsh overhead lights and a crowd of technicians preparing equipment. "There's been a mix-up with scheduling," Richard explained, appearing at Lilia's side. "This was the only space available." Lilia's eyes narrowed. "This wasn't what we agreed to." "I'm handling it." Richard's smile was thin. "Trust me." Stephen knelt beside Sophie, who was already starting to show signs of distress. Her hands were clenching and unclenching. Her breathing had quickened. "We need to get her out of here," he said to Lilia. But it was too late. The cameras were already rolling. Bright lights flooded the small space. A producer was counting down. Richard had positioned himself near the security team, blocking the exit. Sophie's first scream cut through the studio like a knife. Stephen moved toward her, but two security guards stepped into his path. "Sir, you need to stay back." "Get out of my way." He tried to push past them. "She needs help." "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to leave the set." Sophie was on the floor now, thrashing against the hard concrete, surrounded by strangers who were doing everything wrong. Someone grabbed her arm. Someone else shouted for medical assistance. The cameras kept filming. Stephen watched helplessly as the girl he had spent weeks reaching fell apart in front of him. In the chaos, Sophie broke free from the people trying to restrain her. She ran toward the exit, tripped over a cable, and fell hard against the edge of a metal equipment cart. Blood bloomed from a cut on her forehead. The cameras captured everything. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Dorothy's lawyer filed an emergency motion that afternoon, citing the incident as evidence of Stephen's priorities. He was spending his time caring for a billionaire's child, while his own son's needs went unmet. The video of Sophie's meltdown was playing on every news channel, and somehow Dorothy had obtained footage showing Stephen in the background, restrained by security, unable to help either child. The judge granted temporary custody to Dorothy pending a full hearing. Stephen had 48 hours to transfer Jaden to his grandmother's care. He stood in his apartment that night, watching Jaden sleep, and felt something inside him shatter. The next morning, Lilia called him to her office. Her face was pale, her usual composure cracked. "The board is demanding I distance myself from you," she said. "They're calling yesterday's incident a PR disaster. Richard is pushing for a vote of no confidence in my leadership." Stephen understood what she was saying. "You're letting me go." "I have to protect Sophie. I have to protect the company." Lilia wouldn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, Stephen, I truly am." He looked at this woman who had promised to help him, who had seen his son as a solution to her problems, who was now discarding him the moment he became inconvenient. "You're not protecting Sophie," he said quietly. "You're protecting yourself, just like always." He walked out of her office without looking back. 2 days later, he put Jaden in Dorothy's car and watched his son drive away. The boy pressed his palm against the window, his face confused and afraid. Stephen stood on the sidewalk until the car disappeared around the corner. Then he went back inside his empty apartment, sat down on his son's bed, and stared at the wall. Sophie stopped speaking the day after Stephen left. She stopped eating. She stopped sleeping through the night. She stopped responding to the therapists, the nannies, the endless parade of specialists who tried to reach her. She sat in the corner of the sensory room for hours, clutching the small gray stone she had given to Jaden, staring at the door as if waiting for someone who would never come. Lilia watched her daughter retreat into silence and felt the full weight of what she had done. On the third day, she couldn't take it anymore. She dismissed the staff, locked herself in her home office, and began going through every document related to Sophie's care over the past 2 years. Something Stephen had said kept echoing in her mind. The specialists she had hired, the ones who kept failing, the ones who made things worse instead of better. She pulled up employment records, cross-referenced termination dates, tracked the hiring and firing patterns that had seemed random at the time. A picture began to emerge. The competent therapists had all been let go within weeks of starting, replaced by less experienced practitioners who followed rigid protocols that didn't work for Sophie. Every time Sophie showed improvement, something disrupted it. The pattern led back to one person. Lilia called Richard's assistant and requested access to his calendar and communications for the past 18 months. The assistant hesitated, citing privacy concerns. Lilia reminded her who owned the company. It took her 2 hours to find the text messages between Richard and Dorothy. The conversations were carefully coded, but the meaning was clear. Richard had been feeding Dorothy information about Stephen since the beginning. He had provided her with footage from the failed broadcast. He had coached her on how to frame her custody arguments. He had orchestrated the change in filming location that caused Sophie's meltdown. Her own brother had used her daughter as a weapon to destroy her. Lilia sat alone in her office as the sun set over Manhattan. The choices that had led her here spread out before her like a map of her failures. The board meetings that mattered more than bedtime stories. The quarterly reports that took precedence over therapy sessions. The empire she had built at the cost of actually knowing her own child. She could bury this. Confront Richard privately, force him out, quietly, protect the company's reputation. That was what the old Lilia would have done. Control the narrative. Minimize damage. Keep the machine running. But then she looked at the security feed showing Sophie in the sensory room holding a stone and waiting for a friend who wasn't coming. She remembered Stephen, who had lost his son because he tried to help hers. All the years she had chosen power over connection, control over trust, came crashing down on her at once. Lilia picked up her phone and called Stephen. Hey, he almost didn't answer. Stephen was lying on Jaden's bed, surrounded by his son's toys and books, and the lingering smell of the laundry detergent they both used. He had been there for 3 days, leaving only to use the bathroom and drink water. He wasn't sure he would ever get up again. The phone rang 6 times before he finally reached for it. I found something. Lilia's voice was different than he had ever heard it, stripped of its usual armor. I need you to see it. I don't work for you anymore. This isn't about work. It's about what really happened. She took a breath. Richard orchestrated everything. The location change. The security team that blocked you. He's been working with Dorothy for months. Stephen sat up slowly. What? I have the messages. I have proof. Lilia's voice cracked slightly. I know you have no reason to trust me. I know I failed you when it mattered most. But I need your help to make this right. Stephen closed his eyes. Part of him wanted to hang up to let Lilia Hart clean up her own mess the way she always did. But another part of him remembered Jaden in Dorothy's house, confused and scared and separated from the routines that kept him stable. He remembered Sophie, alone and silent, clutching a stone. What do you want me to do? He asked. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for the following morning. Lilia had spent the night preparing her case. She had printouts of Richard's communications with Dorothy, timeline documentation showing how he had systematically undermined Sophie's care records of the specialists he had secretly dismissed before they could make progress. She had enough evidence to end his career and potentially pursue criminal charges. What she didn't have was certainty about what came next. Richard arrived at the meeting looking confident, ready to push through his vote of no confidence. He had positioned himself as the steady alternative to his unstable sister, the one who could lead Hart Media without the distraction of personal problems. He didn't notice the folder Lilia was holding until she slid it across the conference table. Before we proceed with any votes, Lilia said, addressing the room, I'd like to share some information about my brother's activities over the past 18 months. Richard's smile faltered as board members began passing the documents around the table. His face went pale as they reached the text messages with Dorothy. By the time someone read aloud his instructions for changing the broadcast location, he was gripping the arms of his chair like a man watching his future collapse. "This is fabricated," he said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. "She's trying to deflect from her own failures." "The communications came from your company phone," Lilia replied calmly. "The metadata is verifiable. The timestamps match the incidents in question." She looked at her brother with something that might have been pity. "You used my daughter to try to take what you couldn't earn. You manipulated a custody case to destroy an innocent man. And you did it all because you couldn't stand being second." The board voted unanimously to remove Richard from his position and launch an internal investigation. Security escorted him from the building 20 minutes later. He didn't look at Lilia as he passed her. The custody hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning. Stephen sat at the plaintiff's table with Sarah Mitchell, the attorney Lilia had provided. She had won more family court cases than anyone in the state. Across the aisle, Dorothy sat with her own lawyer, looking smaller and older than Stephen remembered. Sarah presented the evidence methodically. Richard's manipulation. The coordinated effort to undermine Stephen's relationship with both children. The text messages showing how Dorothy had been fed misleading information about Stephen's priorities and capabilities. When it was over, the judge looked at Dorothy with something like sympathy. "Mrs. Randy, I understand you believed you were acting in your grandson's best interests, but the evidence shows you were manipulated by a third party with his own agenda." She turned to Stephen. "Mr. Randy, I'm granting you full custody of Jaden effective immediately. I'm also issuing a finding that the original emergency motion was based on fraudulent representations." Stephen barely heard the rest of the ruling. All he could think about was Jaden. He was going to see his son again. Dorothy approached him in the hallway after the hearing. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hands shaking slightly. "I thought I was protecting him," she said quietly. "After Angela died, I watched you struggling. I thought he needed more than you could give." Stephen wanted to be angry. He had every right to be angry, but looking at this woman who had lost her daughter and then watched her grandson slip away, he found he didn't have the energy for rage. "He needs his grandmother too," Stephen said finally. "That doesn't have to change." Dorothy's face crumpled. She nodded once, unable to speak, and walked away. Stephen picked up Jaden that afternoon. His son was sitting on Dorothy's porch when he arrived, a small suitcase beside him. When Jaden saw his father's car pull up, he stood slowly, his face uncertain as if he wasn't sure this was really happening. Stephen knelt on the grass and opened his arms. Jaden walked into them and held on tight. "I'm sorry," Stephen whispered into his son's hair. "I'm so sorry I let you go." Jaden didn't say anything. He just pressed his face against his father's chest and breathed. Now, 1 week later, Lilia came to Brooklyn. She had texted Stephen the day before asking if she could see him. Not at her office, not at the penthouse, somewhere neutral. He had suggested the small park near his apartment, the one where he used to take Jaden to feed the pigeons. She was already there when he arrived, sitting on a bench near the swings. Sophie was with her, holding the gray stone in both hands, scanning the playground with anxious eyes. Then Sophie saw Jaden. Her whole body changed. The tension in her shoulders released. Something like light came into her face. She stood up and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away, waiting. Jaden looked at his father. Stephen nodded. The two children sat down together on the swings, not talking, not touching, just existing in the same space the way they had in the sensory room. Sophie held out the stone. Jaden took it, examined it carefully, and handed it back. It was the most natural thing Stephen had ever seen. Lilia walked over to stand beside him. She looked different than she had in her office. Smaller somehow, less certain. "I resigned as CEO," she said. Stephen turned to look at her. "Why?" "Because I realized I was trying to run an empire and learn how to be a mother at the same time, and I kept choosing wrong." She watched Sophie swing gently back and forth. "I don't know who I am if I'm not running something. I've never had to figure that out before." "That sounds terrifying," Stephen said. Lilia almost smiled. "It is." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I wouldn't forgive me. I'm working on it." Stephen watched the children together. "You made a mistake. A big one. But you also fixed it when it counted. That doesn't undo the damage." "No, but it's a start." They stood in silence as the afternoon light softened around them. Sophie got off the swing and walked toward her mother. She didn't speak. She just reached out her hand. Lilia looked down at her daughter's outstretched fingers. For a moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she took Sophie's hand and let herself be led toward the swings. Stephen watched them go. Lilia sat down on a swing and Sophie stood behind her, gently pushing. It was clumsy and awkward and nothing like the polished image Lilia Hart had spent her life projecting. It was also the most human Stephen had ever seen her look. Jaden tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, I'm hungry." Stephen smiled and lifted his son onto his shoulders. "Ice cream." Jaden considered this seriously. "Yes." They walked toward the park exit, leaving Lilia and Sophie on the swings behind them. At the edge of the playground, Stephen turned back for one last look. Sophie was laughing. It was soft and uncertain, like she had forgotten how, and was just remembering. Lilia was laughing too, tears streaming down her face. Two families, two different worlds, both broken in their own ways, both learning to heal. Not a fairy tale ending, not everything fixed and perfect and tied up with a bow. Just two fathers and two children who had found something real in the most unexpected places. Stephen turned away and carried his son toward home. Sometimes healing doesn't come from the people with the most degrees or the biggest budgets. Sometimes it comes from someone who simply understands what it feels like to love a child the world doesn't quite know how to reach. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt like you were fighting alone for someone you love, know that you're not. We share these stories because connection matters. Understanding matters. And sometimes the person who changes everything is the one nobody expected. If you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things, about the quiet courage it takes to show up for the ones we love, consider subscribing to this channel. Every story we tell is a reminder that none of us are as alone as we sometimes feel. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. And remember, the most powerful thing you can offer anyone is simply to see them for who they really are.